I want to hit some likes, but
Good evening. My name is Tom Giroux. I'm the Vice President of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar tonight. Up on the screen, you can see our mission: inform, educate, archive, and publish. Tonight, we're informing and educating about a really unique story. So we hope that you would join the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. You can see our webpage up there. It's a very reasonable membership fee of $20 a year, and you would be able to contribute to this. Our webinar
I think we have, Tom, I think we have John's page sharing right or shared right now.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Is it up now?
It's saying it's starting.
Is it up?
John, do you see it? I still have John's slides.
All right, John, if you want to stop sharing.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay, yeah, there's a stop share. Okay.
There you go.
All right. Sorry about that. I always got a little technical problem, but we worked our way through it. Thanks for your patience. There again, you can see our mission: inform, educate, archive, and publish. Like I said, we'd love to have you as a member and contribute to our work. Our webinars are free and open to the public. That's part of our education mission. So I'm going to turn it over to Don Schnitzler, who's my coworker, and he's going to tell you a little bit about how the webinar is going to work and introduce our speaker.
Okay. As Tom said, my name is Don Schnitzler. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the Forest History Association, and I am pleased to welcome you to this 2024 webinar presentation tonight. To help make the experience successful for everyone, a couple rules that we'd like to talk about. First off, if any questions arise during the process or during the presentation, down at the bottom of the screen is a chat feature. Use the chat feature to pose the question, and we will save those questions or hold those questions to the end and then relay them to our speaker. If during the presentation you have any trouble with the platform, the Zoom platform, you can use that same chat feature to reach out to Tom or I, and we can see what we can do to work through those technical difficulties. And finally, at the end of tonight's presentation, you're going to receive a short 7-question survey. We'd appreciate it if you take the time to just fill that in so we kind of have an idea that we are meeting our mission and providing the type of product that you're interested in receiving. So again, simple 7 questions, and then we will share the responses with our speaker. This evening's presentation is entitled Cornell University and Northern Wisconsin's Pinelands, a cost-benefit analysis. Cornell University founder Ezra Cornell leveraged New York State's allocation of public lands under the Morrill Act of 1862 to select over 512,000 acres of pine timberland in northern Wisconsin. Later, he and the university managed this as a long-term real estate investment for over 70 years. This talk will discuss the ongoing financial benefit accruing to Cornell University from its former Wisconsin landholdings and assess its impact over time on Wisconsin's environment and the human populations. Our speaker tonight, as I mentioned, is Jon Parmenter. He's an associate professor at the history at Cornell University, who teaches courses in early American and Indigenous North American history. He is currently completing a book entitled Dispossessed: Cornell University's Origin in Indian Country. Like you, I am looking forward to hearing more about Cornell University and the Wisconsin Pinelands. And I am pleased to welcome Dr. Parmenter. Although I see his image disappeared. Oh, good. All right. I was getting a little nervous there. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Parmenter to tonight's talk and turn the platform over to him.
Okay.
For this evening's presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so
everyone.
much for the kind introduction, Don. I guess I'll do my screen share now real quickly here. I think it's this one. Okay. Get it up there. And then do it here. Okay. Okay. I think does it show up okay?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. Thanks. So again, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm the slide here, it gives you a bit of it's sort of the title of the book I'm working on. I'm hoping the book will be out in 2026. I'm working on finishing it up this summer. It's really great to have the chance to talk to folks today. I am going to talk a little bit about Cornell's history, but also about what Cornell's acquisition of that extensive tract of pine timberland in northern Wisconsin meant over time for both people in Wisconsin and people in New York State. I want to start out by talking a little bit about the land acknowledgements. Many of you are probably familiar with the idea of a land acknowledgement, where these are associated with an institution or a university where someone will come in and sort of explain how the university sits atop or occupies or resides on land that was formerly held by Indigenous people. Cornell University has a land acknowledgement. I'm not going to go into it here in detail, but it's interesting because when it's spoken, and it's usually sort of a spoken kind of text, it's given at ceremonies and openings and graduation and things like this. It frames the university's relationship with dispossession in a very interesting way. It frames it as something that happened in the past, something that's over, something that maybe we can look back on as the product of less enlightened times. And what I'm going to argue tonight in kind of three stages is that view of Cornell's relationship to Indigenous dispossession isn't quite complete, accurate, or satisfactory. First of all, I'll point out that Cornell's benefits from the Morrill Act of 1862 were not only absolutely essential to the institution's survival, they are actually not things that are confined to the past. They are an ongoing stream of revenue to our institution, representing something on the order of $4.5 million a year in unrestricted income that flows into the university. The second point I'll make is maybe a little less controversial, but also important for factual understanding, is that no land grant college or university in the United States received more under the Morrill Act than Cornell did. Cornell received about 10% of the acreage allocated by the law because Cornell was New York's designated land grant institution. By 1900, a little less than 40 years later, Cornell University had accrued about 1/3 of all the revenue from the Morrill Act nationwide into its own bank accounts. So no institution received more from the Morrill Act than Cornell did. And I would argue that very few, to the point of none, have done less than Cornell to acknowledge that legacy in a material way. And that leads me to the third argument that I'll be making this evening, is that given the extent to which Cornell continues to benefit from the proceeds of Indigenous dispossession, it actually does owe reparative action to the Indigenous communities materially impacted by its actions as a settler colonial landholder and as the producer of knowledge that further altered local ecologies in line with settler economic priorities after that initial dispossession took place. So all the colleges of agricultural extension, the various engineering things that were applied actually at Cornell and other land grant institutions actually pushed the impact of dispossession even further. Okay, so we're going to be going into this investigation of institutional history in a bit of a different way than is often typically the case. The typical sort of university study or history tends to emphasize the lives of particular personalities. Most of them are dead white guys, There are some dead white guys in our story tonight, but we're going to also talk about Cornell as a deeply embedded organization shaped by its founding, its financing, and a shifting array of interests, some of them over 1,000 miles away, many of them in your state of Wisconsin. Okay. So that's what we're up to here tonight. These are the arguments that I'll make, and we'll sort of go through and track this and see how we do. Okay. So the Morrill Act of 1862 is best understood as one of three pieces of related legislation passed by the Civil War truncated Congress, which secured the West for the Union's vision of what the nation's future would be. So the Morrill Act, in conjunction with the Pacific Railroad Act and the Homestead Act, all passed over a very short period of time in the early summer of 1862, were intended to take a resource that the nation held in abundance, its public land, and convert it to particular desired purposes. In our case, the idea of land grant colleges and universities that would be different from the kinds of classical education that was offered at most institutions at this point in time. These were intended to be more applied kinds of institutions where agricultural education, engineering was called the mechanic arts back then, and it's often overlooked, but military science was also supposed to be part of the mission here. So practical education, something a little different than what people were getting at Harvard, Princeton, or Yale at that point in time, something that would be open also to the nation, to a broader swath of the nation's citizens. Okay, the middle and working classes and the farming classes would be able to access this institution. So that was the motivation behind it. Okay, and the financing for this was essentially using the nation's resources of public land that had been purchased from indigenous nations, surveyed, but not yet sold, and reallocating that to finance, in this case, land grant colleges and universities. What's important to appreciate for folks is that by 1862, eastern states, pretty much everything east of Ohio, had no public land remaining within their boundaries. It had all been taken up and sold. So those states, New York among them, were given land scrip, which was effectively a coupon, if you will, for acreage that it could take and locate in other states to secure revenue for their institutions. Okay, and this is the big innovation that Mr. Cornell and his advisors took advantage of at this point in time. Okay, nobody else in the East did what Cornell did. Most of the other institutions were not familiar with this kind of investment procedure. They did not want to take on the paperwork burden of managing a long-term real estate investment based in other states. So most of the other eastern states, in fact, all of them, the scrip receiving states, just basically dumped their land scrip on the open market, often at a steep discount from its face value of $1.25 per acre, and essentially just cashed it out. Okay. A whole market existed in agricultural college scrip for the next 20 or 30 years. A lot of people bought it up low and held it in order to sell it higher later. But Mr. Cornell did something very different. Mr. Cornell zigged when everyone else zagged, you might say. Okay. So what exactly did he do? Well, because New York State had in 1862 the largest congressional representation, a combination of 31 representatives and 2 senators, it received the largest allocation of Morrill Act scrip of any state in the Union. Okay, so 6,187 pieces were received formally by the state of New York on May 5th, 1863. Those, each piece of scrip accounted for 160 acres. So a little under 990,000 acres came into New York State's possession. Mr. Cornell was able to purchase from New York State a little over 913,000 acres worth of scrip. Okay, by the time he got interested in this and he got his sort of plan and proposal up and running, the state had already sold a bit of its scrip to some other people, so he didn't get all of it, but he got quite a bit of it. Okay, the lion's share was actually acquired by Mr. Cornell to be used as a long-term real estate investment for the benefit of the institution bearing his name. So on this slide, the acreage there is kind of broken down. Just under 500,000 acres in the state of Wisconsin, a little under 8,000 acres in Minnesota, and a little under 4,000 acres in Kansas. The balance of Cornell's acreage was also then sold in scrip format, sold as paper, when they basically ran out of the kind of land they wanted to acquire. And what they wanted to acquire, and the reason why there's so much of that acreage in Wisconsin, is that Mr. Cornell had two very close friends in New York State who were both lumbermen, Henry Sage and John McGraw. And they advised Mr. Cornell that if he was interested in a long-term real estate hold, pine timberland in northern Wisconsin represented one of the best ways to do that. Okay, so when he bought this land, this was all land that at the time is it's called public land open for entry. And what that means is that it had gone up for public auction and it had failed to meet the price, the minimum price, the federal minimum of $1.25 per acre. So at the time, nobody wanted to pay $1.25 per acre for it. It was sitting there. Mr. Cornell, armed with a lot of scrip, almost 6,200 pieces of it, had agents out in Wisconsin very diligently and rapidly selecting pine timberland with that scrip in order to get it into the university's possession. Okay. At the bottom of this slide, you'll notice the website. This is a link to our blog that we've put up here at the university. I would point out that this is not an officially university sanctioned website. It is the website that myself and several of my colleagues here have acquired and used to post our research about this. So there's more documentation on this available there, and we do kind of update it fairly regularly, and more content is expected on that later this year, including a quite interesting data visualization project that we're pretty excited about. So I think it'll be pretty neat when that's all done. But that's a good place to go and look, cuidproject.com, for some of the background on this particular issue. Okay, where does this land come from? Okay, this was where my research, I kind of got interested in this. I was trying to we sort of located the parcels in a database and then sort of set them against the boundaries of prior treaty surrenders. Okay. And what we've basically identified is that the lands that the university acquired for itself and managed for profit came from 9 distinct Indigenous surrenders from 5 different nations spanning the years 1825 to 1851. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on that. I've written about that, and you can read about that on the blog, but you'll notice here, I'm sure, that a great deal of that is located in north and northwestern Wisconsin. You can see bits and pieces in Minnesota. You can see bits and pieces in what are now Kansas. Okay, so they're all keyed to the particular surrender. So this was very interesting to me. My own specialty is in the 18th century, and I didn't really know very much when I went into this project about just how much data the United States has preserved on land cessions from the 19th century. And there's quite a bit of information out there. And with the assistance of some very intrepid and intelligent graduate students at Cornell, we were able to get this map together to sort of give a picture of where the dispossession came from. Obviously, the 1837 Ojibwe Treaty stands out as the primary donor of land that came into the university's possession through the Morrill Act. Okay, that was one of the primary places that the university targeted, okay, for it. And, you know, the way this worked was really a paper economy. Okay, you can see here, and I apologize for the resolution, that's a little blurry, but on the left is a piece of agricultural college script. Okay, so the university took in almost 6,200 pieces of paper like this. Okay, it's basically a blank coupon for 160 acres of public land open to entry anywhere in the United States. And on the right, you can see with this is the associated what's called certificate of entry that was entered at the Eau Claire, Wisconsin land office on August 10th, 1866. This is script number 1189, which is over here. It's got Ezra Cornell's name on it, and it's the southwest quarter of section 17, town 36, range 9 west. So this is all done through basically a grid. The record keeping on this is incredible. Our archival collection here that I went through in the research process for my book is a 68 box collection. It's took me the better part of a year and a half to sort of chew my way through that. It was an incredibly extensive enterprise that the university participated in for the better part of 70 years. Okay, the last parcel of land that the university owned in Wisconsin was sold in 1935. Most of what the university had in Wisconsin had been sold by about 1920, but they did have one particular parcel that it took them a little while longer to get rid of. But this is how it worked. It was very much kind of an intensive bureaucratic process. It occupied a great deal of our university treasurer's time. My conclusion is this had to be what this guy's job was most of the time. There were days where he wrote 20 and 30 letters a day, dealt with business arrangements, and you know, basically just managed this process. Okay. So when this has gotten folded into Cornell's historical narrative, it tends to sort of have a trajectory of onward and upward. Okay, we would call it the Whig interpretation of history. Sometimes, you know, sort of the positive side of the story, the happy ending, the process that got us to the happy ending. And that's where it stops. Okay, when I got into this project, that was kind of what I was expecting to see, that this would be a moneymaker from the get-go and onward and upward, and here we are. Okay, what I learned was something a little different. Okay, Mr. Cornell himself passed away in 1874. He did not live to see the return on his investment for our institution. The management of the university's land holdings fell to a group known as the Western Land Committee. It was sort of a subcommittee of our board of trustees. It was headed up by Henry Sage, himself a very prominent timber speculator and lumberman, very wealthy. And much of the actual work was done, as I mentioned, by the university's treasurer. What's interesting and what kind of caught my attention is that by 1881, Mr. Cornell's gift of over 500,000 acres of federally donated public land, bequeathed to the university upon his death in 1874, had just about brought down the entire enterprise 7 years later. The carrying costs of the land, the taxes, the timber estimation, staffing, the losses from theft and fire exceeded the total receipts from sales of timber and land by 1881. In fact, things were so bad at the university by this point in time, the university lost a third of its endowment capital between the years 1875 and 1881. Okay, and that's actually, for those of you familiar with financial funding of institutions, that's very, very bad when you're dipping into your endowment to that degree. Okay, This was really a pretty dark time. The president of our university at that point in time was Andrew Dixon White. Mr. White was a close friend and confidant of Mr. Cornell. He and Mr. Cornell built this place. In 1880, Mr. White took the job of U.S. ambassador to Germany. And a lot of times people have kind of wondered why he did that. And my own personal feeling and speculation and opinion on that is that he did not want to be around to watch this place go under, and it was pretty close to going under. You can see in this picture here, this was Cornell University in 1881. 3 primary buildings, okay? Morrill Hall here, McGraw Hall, which is where my office currently is. And then beyond it, what's now called White Hall, it had the less romantic name of building number 2, I think, at that point in time, but it's named after A.D. White now. The chapel was there. Mr. Sage made sure of that. And there were a couple of houses scattered across the grounds, but that was it. Okay, this was a very much an institution on the brink. And in March of 1881, something kind of very interesting happened. Henry Sage, then the president of the Board of Trustees, came to a meeting and announced that he had declined an offer from a New York-based lumber syndicate to purchase over 275,000 acres of the university's remaining 376,000 acres of pine timberland in northern Wisconsin for a price of $1.25 million. He turned it down. Okay. And that shocked people. People were stunned. Why had he done this? Okay. That was Sage's whole modus operandi prior to this point in time. He had argued that the best way to liquidate the university's holdings were through these large sales, and he had just turned one down. Why did he do that? Well, what not many people knew at the time was that Mr. Sage had some inside information. He had a copy, an advanced copy of the 1880 Federal Census Report on the Forests of the United States, a report that was written by none other than the university's former Wisconsin agent, a guy named Henry Putnam. Okay, Putnam was himself a lumberman in Wisconsin of some renown. He had been tasked by the census to do this report, and his report produced statistics that, as my predecessor at Cornell, Paul Wallace Gates, wrote, shocked the national lumber trade to its very foundations. What Mr. Putnam said in that 1880 census report was that at current rates of cutting of white pine that was at least 14 inches in diameter, there was less than 20 years of standing white pine left in the United States. Okay, and he was mainly referring to the timber states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and I guess they included Pennsylvania in that too. Okay, this was a bombshell. Okay, this was something that immediately escalated the price of pine to previously unheard of levels. Mr. Sage knew this, and Mr. Sage played this card extremely well. Notwithstanding the opinion of the industry, and you can actually read the trade journals from 1880 and 1881, and people who also got copies of Putnam's advanced report and said, this is actually ridiculous. There's no way this is right. Putnam is an interested party in all this. He himself is a very large pine dealer. None of that mattered. The report took on a life of its own and had an immediate effect on the price of white pine. And here was the difference. Up until that point in time, mill owners were reluctant to buy standing timber until they were ready to cut. Now they realized that if they were going to protect their investments in infrastructure, in their mills, in their saws, and in their labor force, they were going to have to acquire reserves of timber. And by 1881, the primary owner of the best and stands of white timber on drivable streams in northern Wisconsin was Cornell University. They had been sitting and waiting for the better part of 2 decades for something like this to happen. They almost waited long enough to go out of business, but in fact, they got out and got into several very sizable deals that saved the institution from bankruptcy. Okay, so in 1881, the price of pine timber was essentially ranging between 50 cents and $1 per 1,000 board feet, standing in the tree, as it was referred to. In September of 1881, representatives from the Menominee, Wisconsin-based Knapstout and Company traveled to Ithaca, okay, and actually negotiated with Mr. Sage and the trustees the purchase of about 31,000 acres of pine and land for $477,500. Okay, that was equivalent to $2 per 1,000 board feet standing in the tree, basically double, if not more, the price. Unheard of at the time. Okay, that actually represented the break-even point for Cornell's Western land investments. All subsequent sales were pure profit on the balance sheet. Okay, and of course, the actions of Knapp and Stout drew the attention of their large-scale competitors. And in the spring of 1882, Frederick Weyerhaeuser, agent for the Chippewa Logging Company, owner of the Chippewa Logging Company, also came to Cornell and negotiated an absolute blockbuster deal for 109,601 acres of pine timberland for just over $1.8 million. Okay, that was $3 per 1,000 feet standing in the tree, and another 50 cents per acre for the land. Okay, these were, to that point in time, the largest sales and the highest prices paid in the national white pine industry. So just 15 months after turning down $1.25 million for 275,000 acres, Mr. Sage had accrued $2.3 million for just under 141,000 acres. Okay, so this was a fantastic deal for the university. This put the university on a path to which it has never looked back from. Okay, this was, and we'll talk about this in a minute here, the university's salvation, as it was put. Okay, so one of the things that historians do is talk about raw figures. Okay, and it's also historians' job to put those raw figures into proper context so we can assess their meaning. Okay, so one of the things that I've been doing in my research is sort of looking at the relationship between the revenues from the Western lands and the university's overall budget. And realistically, you can see here, and maybe that's a little small, but beginning in 1882, when the profit margin turned in the university's favor, the proportion of income from Western lands represented as much as 99% of the university's annual income, and it only fell below 20% at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Okay, so these are figures that are all based on my own research in the university's financial records. This will be something that when the data visualization is up and running on the blog, this will all be documented down to the penny. We're getting there. It's been quite a journey in a way. But if you don't believe me, you can actually read the proceedings of the Cornell University Board of Trustees. And on October 30th, 1889, the Western Land Committee met and reflected on its sales from 1881 onward. And I'll just read a little bit of the quote here because it really does kind of capture, I think, the significance of this money to the university's historical trajectory. And I think this is Henry Sage speaking here. We've had since August of 1881, $3,928,796.44 in solid cash or its equivalent in productive securities poured into our treasury. All this in 8 years. What wonder that we have felt the impulses of such prosperity, that we've had the power to increase the pay of our professors, as well as their members, the ability to build buildings, to increase equipment, and here's the punchline, by the wise use of all, and by deserving it, to command public patronage. We've secured large benefits from others in buildings and endowments, in cash, in personal service. So this is the thing that people have to bear in mind, okay? The investment of the proceeds of this land and timber sales from Wisconsin placed the university on a sound financial footing for all time. The threat of bankruptcy disappeared. Cornell was now solidly established as a going concern, and the institution reaped the benefits of additional patronage from other sources as a result of that status. Nobody was going to give money to Cornell in 1881 when it looked like it was about to fold. But by 1882 and 1883, a totally different picture emerges, and we have a university pulled from the brink of disaster. Okay. And it's interesting because this particular account of the university's origins is not one that has been discussed openly for a very long period of time. But when it was happening, and shortly afterwards, so in the late 19th and very early 20th century, university officials were much less reticent about talking and discussing about these profits and their origin and significance to the university. Both the university's third president, a gentleman named Jacob Gold Sherman, and its most famous early faculty member, the English historian Goldwin Smith, referred to the land sales of 1881 and 1882 unequivocally as the university's salvation. Okay, and that word, is quoted directly. Okay, a little bit more about the money. Okay, because again, this is part of what my own research has been trying to sort of establish and nail down. By 1923, when for all intents and purposes, the university had essentially liquidated its holdings in Wisconsin, it sold the pine, then the hardwoods, and then finally the cutover land as farmland. It had spent $1.7 million in order to gross $6.8 million, yielding a net profit of $5.1 million. Okay, in 1935, the university, after selling its last parcel in Wisconsin, formally closed the books on the Western land, as they referred to it, business, as kind of an active revenue agenda. And they essentially capitalized the profits into an investment fund. Okay, that money exists to this day. It's referred to as the Cornell Endowment Fund, and its current principal is believed to be in the range of $72 million, yielding an annual interest payout believed to be about $4.5 million in unrestricted funds. In addition to that, there is also an annual payment through another kind of arrangement that was made with the scrip purchase, an annual payment from New York State of $34,429 that comes into the institution every year. Okay, now you've noticed probably that my language here has been a bit equivocal, that I've used the phrase believed to be. And the reason I did that is because these figures were publicly reported in institutional financial reports down to 2005. In 2006, they switched over from a dollars and cents reporting to a reporting in shares that I have not been able to decipher. And then in 2009, these accounts and many others disappeared from the university's public accounting that employees have access to. I have asked the institution for the current balance of the principal and annual interest yield. I have not been given that information. So what you're seeing here, the 72 million and principal and the $4.5 million in unrestricted interest payout every year, is basically a very simple consumer price index modification that I've done in lieu of the actual information. I've tried to make the argument that everyone would be best served by working with actual data, but I have not been able to get a response from the administration on that particular issue. I'll keep trying. We can always be hopeful that we'll get it at some point. Okay. Again, just to sort of put things into context again, before we start talking about impacts here, if you were to take the Morrill Act lands and identify them as a discrete donor to the institution, it would be the third largest income stream coming into the university prior to World War I. Okay, on the far left, you'll see the $600 million given by Colonel Payne that essentially funded Cornell's medical school, which is in New York City. The Sage family, Henry Sage and his sons, were extremely generous benefactors to the institution. The value of the income from the Morrill Act lands, by my calculations, actually exceeds that of our founder himself, from a purely financial point in time. Okay, and I would point out that this is far and away an extremely conservative measure of the financial impact of the Morrill Act lands on the university over time. So what I've tried to argue here is that when we talk about the university's founders as the individuals or entities who establish an institution, we certainly need to add in the indigenous nations whose lands contributed directly to the university's bottom line at a very crucial moment in its history. Okay, so I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about impacts now. Okay, and this will largely focus on indigenous folks in Wisconsin, but there is actually some other information here that is of import and value to the non-native population in Wisconsin as well. Okay, so I'm sure that people in this organization are familiar with this particular phenomenon. People out east are not. No one had ever seen anything like this when I showed this picture at a version of this talk I gave earlier this spring. This was shocking to people. The landscape of the Wisconsin cutover was horrifying to people. Okay. And this is just one of the things that the university left in its wake, unfortunately. Okay. Cornell's salvation was largely the state of Wisconsin's loss. Okay. And to the extent this has been addressed in scholarship to date, historians have really emphasized 2 points. The first point being a comparison of Cornell's federally enabled taking in Wisconsin under the Morrill Act of 1862, compared to the endowment allocated to the state of Wisconsin's land-grant university, University of Wisconsin-Madison, under that same legislation. The state of Wisconsin obviously had a much smaller congressional delegation in 1862. It only received 240,000 acres of public land for its land-grant college, which it promptly selected in the southern part of the state as farmland and sold it to settlers. Okay, this was in response to public pressure in the state of Wisconsin that the federal grant be used to bolster settlement in the state, attract permanent settlement, population increase. And they sold, excuse me, they sold those 240,000 acres of land for $300,000 total. The interest on which would barely pay the salaries of a half dozen professors, even at that point in time. So much for playing by the rules of the Morrill Act. A second thing that historians have emphasized to this date is kind of a broader sense of injustice among the people of the state of Wisconsin concerning the federal government allowing Cornell University, an absentee landholder, to extract huge profits from the state to which it contributed very little in return, save for taxes paid, while undeniably accelerating the timber barons' destruction of irreplaceable old growth forest in the space of a single generation. A process described by one contemporary national publication as wanton, short-sighted, and stupid. But the most important point, in my view, has been overlooked until quite recently. As one of the largest landowners of the choicest pine timberlands in northern Wisconsin after 1881, Cornell University played a fundamental role in setting not only the prices for standing timber in the Chippewa Valley, but also the pace of settler colonial intrusion into the cutover lands of the state's northern counties. A few of the things that happened, okay? And the way I like to talk about this is how the university's post-1881 sales binge actually achieved what might be called the final conclusive dispossession of the lands and resources of the northern part of the state from Wisconsin's indigenous peoples. You're probably familiar with the terms of the 1837 and 1842 treaties, in which the Ojibwe surrendered large tracts of land in what would become the state of Wisconsin, but retained rights of access to hunt, fish, and gather resources on ceded lands. The intrusion of loggers, many of whom were working on Cornell contracts after 1868, initiated damages to Ojibwe wild rice gathering, both from the flooding caused by dam construction and from logs floated downstream that wrecked the fragile surface beds. And there's documentation of indigenous people complaining about this that date to the very late 1860s and early 1870s. Okay, so that was certainly one thing that was an undeniable impact of all of this. The second would be confinement on reservations. Okay, so prior to this point in time, and this didn't really hit home to me until I came out to Wisconsin last summer and did some research and some talking to people, and that fundamentally changed the project in many ways. But it really hit home to me after that visit how crucial that 1880 to 1882 time period was for marking the point in time at which indigenous people were able to sort of leverage the access to off-reservation resources and to when they were increasingly confined on to their reservations. The map there shows where those are located. Okay, an early historian of Barron County, Wisconsin, described the process quite succinctly. Well, the presence of indigenous people in proximity to logging camps was tolerated owing to the character of the settler population as largely young, well-armed white men and the utility of the indigenous people as a source of wage labor. As lumbering shifted to farming, there were more and more isolated cabins with women and children left alone during long winter months, with men away working in lumber camps. And many of the white people in that particular time period and area began to appeal to the state to keep Native people confined to their reservations. And the way they did it, the primary way they did it was through enforcement of state game laws. Okay, and those game laws were themselves violations of federal treaties, but by invoking the danger posed by free-ranging, dangerous, and allegedly drunken Indians, state authorities were able to get enough kind of popular support to force indigenous people to stay on their reservations. And as this historian put it, as the heavy timbers were cut off and the Indians disappeared, their old hunting grounds, now converted into rich farms, knew them no more. So it's a bit of that kind of vanishing Indian rhetoric from the late 19th century that we may be familiar with, but it really was, in a sense, a dramatic change, and really the first time, and that's what really hit home to me, was this is the first time that these communities were stuck kind of on much smaller tracts of land than they were traditionally accustomed to making use of. Okay, their subsistence economy up to that point in time had depended upon access to off-reservation ceded lands for, you know, gathered foods, hunting, fishing, you name it. And now increasingly, they were confined to these reservations. And not only were they confined to reservations, the large sales that the university negotiated with the big operators, so Knapstout and Weyerhaeuser, could come in and drop multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars on the university. That left many of the smaller lumber operators in Wisconsin out in the cold. And what they ended up deciding to do was pressure for access to logging on reservations. Okay, so you can see that's a picture of logging that was going on the Lacoudere Reservation as late as 1909. Okay, but this became something that was very significant and changed the ecologies and resources available to people on reservations themselves. Okay, so the scramble for northern Wisconsin's white pine timber after 1881 really was kind of fundamental to getting this process started. The Interior Department opened up logging contracts on the allotted tracts on these reservations, Bad River, Red Cliff, and Lac after 1882. It did not take long for irregularities to be reported. Disregard of limitations on cutting, underpayment for logs, overcharging Ojibwe crews for supplies, bringing non-native crews onto the reservations to cut. By 1889, a Senate committee investigation into the logging practices on the Ojibwe reservations of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota was undertaken. It's a 900-page document that essentially says this is a disaster. The timber is being cut and sold at too fast a rate. It's not going to be a sustainable enterprise for the Indigenous people, but nothing changed. Okay, and by World War I, most of the logging on these reservations, as I understand it, has pretty much come to an end. Okay, so you can see, I think, some interesting kinds of, and when I was out in Wisconsin, I collected a few images from various repositories of this period of time to try and kind of understand in the visual record what had gone on here. Okay, and you can see some very interesting things. This is the Lac Reservation in the early 20th century. Don't have a precise date. You can see here kind of the mix of a log structure, and you can see with some wigwams, some bark wigwams in the background. These are just fairly modest circumstances. I think most people would agree, but this is these communities' first sustained engagement with the assimilative forces of settler colonialism. This is when it actually hits. Okay, and some very significant things happen. Okay, here you see for the first time large-scale intermarriage between predominantly Indigenous women and non-Native men, largely French Canadian. In this case, I believe these are French Canadian loggers and their Ojibwe wives and children. Okay, that produces very significant changes in these communities, as we'll see. Okay, education. Okay, the universe, once people are confined on reservation, they are accessible for experimentation and policy initiatives by the federal government in ways that they had not before. On the left is an image of the Hayward Indian School that was located near the Lac community. This is a picture. I'm not sure exactly which school this is from, but this is sort of the instruction in sewing that was kind of offered to girls, Indigenous girls from these communities. Another practice that was fairly common at this point in time was to actually recruit Native girls from these communities as domestic servants and kind of rent them out to white families in the area, well-to-do white families. And I was reading the papers of one of the agents who was responsible for that, and the letters that came back from that were pretty tough to read, just in terms of the treatment and the experience that those young girls had as a result of this. Okay, a final thing that also happens for the first time after 1882 is the arrival in significant number of missionaries. Okay, in large number. Okay, so I think it's best understood as a process. Okay, no one would argue that Cornell University initiated the dispossession of Indigenous people in northern Wisconsin. That was done by the federal government. But the university's economic development initiatives most certainly accelerated the consequences of the federal government's initial dispossession for the Indigenous populations of Wisconsin and also Minnesota and Kansas as well. Okay. In the meantime, 1,000 miles to the east, Cornell University grew by leaps and bounds. It is worth noting that Cornell University began its ascent to the pinnacle of American higher education during the last 2 decades of the 19th century, precisely when Ojibwe people from the Bad River, Lac Lac du Flambeau, Red Cliff, St. Croix, and Sokeagon reservations were forced to send off their children to government-run boarding schools. and other forms of state-sponsored assimilation followed, with dramatic effects on these communities' cultural integrity. Mr. Cornell's acquisition of public lands, the proceeds of prior acts of federal dispossession and various treaties with Indigenous nations in northern Wisconsin, and the management of those lands by his successors for the benefit of the university, initiated their transformation from what might be described as an idle state, where Indigenous people were still able to exercise treaty rights to hunt and fish on them, into one of active settler colonial development that saw them penetrated, stripped of their resources, and their ecologies forever altered. This, in my view, affected the actual alienation of those lands from what might be described as the reach of Indigenous people. They no longer had the ability to use the resources, some of which were guaranteed by treaties, on those lands. So Cornell University's post-Morrill Act presence in the state of Wisconsin not only facilitated an extractive process of incredible scale, it superimposed a new human geography over a previous Indigenous landscape. Survey lines, property, boundaries, logging camps, roads, railways, and farms that all followed in the wake of Cornell University's acquisition and management of the pine timberlands of northern Wisconsin all mark new exclusionary patterns that kept Indigenous people confined to reservations, where dwindling access to the material necessities of life often forced them into the surrounding wage labor economy. So what I've tried to do in my research and in my talk this evening and in the book that I'm writing is to kind of connect Cornell University's history to this story of Indigenous dispossession. In March of 2020, the publication High Country News published an piece of investigative journalism, an award-winning piece of investigative journalism that connected the history of land-grant universities to Indigenous dispossession in a way that no one else had ever done. Okay, in many ways, it was the inspiration for the project I've currently taken on. When I read that report and found out that our university was the primary beneficiary nationally from all this, it was quite shocking. I'll be honest with you. It was also a bit embarrassing that I had worked here for 20 years and I hadn't really figured this out. So it's been interesting over the past 3.5 years that we've kind of been dealing with this locally and talking with people and doing research and presenting it. The response of the institution to greater public awareness of its quantifiable relationship to Indigenous possession, I think, probably could be described as rather halting in nature. And I think this stems from a perception among our university's administration that connecting the university's history to Indigenous dispossession constitutes an attack on the institution's past. I think it should actually be seen as an enlargement of our knowledge and understanding of the institution's past. Okay, it doesn't require a particularly deep understanding of history to recognize that efforts to forget or bury unpleasant pasts have a way of failing miserably. History is rarely as distant from us as we might think or hope. And while it's true that the truth may not set us free, if we do want to try to reconcile, acknowledging the truth and its constituent facts is an essential part of the process, along with the development of mutual respect, accountability, and crucially recognition of the harms experienced by victims. Okay, a person can think of land-grant universities as good places and also look at with clear eyes at the times they have not lived up to their professed values. Doing more than simply acknowledging these chapters, studying them, educating current and future generations about them are not signs that you hate them or that you're calling for their demise or bankruptcy. Okay, so one of the things that I've tried to do is try to understand how institutions grappling with similarly complicated and arguably troubled pasts have handled things. And the closest analogy that I've kind of come to is actually Georgetown University. Georgetown University in 1838 was facing bankruptcy. It sold 272 slaves to basically bail itself out of financial disaster. Okay. I had the good fortune to host a speaker series this past spring at Cornell, and we had Adam Rothman from Georgetown University come in and gave a tremendous talk, explained the sort of situation there and how it had sort of played out and how it's currently being played out, with a conversation about reparative action by the university. And there were some tremendous parallels between Georgetown's experience and our own. Okay, sales of assets, in their case, human beings. In our case, pine timberlands, that actually saved an institution, not only saved an institution from bankruptcy, but were of existential significance to the institution's future. Okay, that there were measurable negative human impacts on populations at a distance from the institution. In our case, the indigenous people in northern Wisconsin, first and foremost. In the case of Georgetown, the sold slaves went from plantations in Maryland to plantations in Louisiana. And ironically enough, their ongoing practice of Catholicism was what enabled the researchers to reconstruct the family histories and trace the descendants of the enslaved people who were out there. This was a tremendously well-documented story in both cases, and both stories were hiding in plain sight for many, many years, okay, before people came along and started asking questions and started trying to look into this at a deeper level. The receipts are there, okay? We know what happened. We know exactly how much money was made. We know about the people who were impacted, okay? The question becomes, what constitutes an appropriate path toward reconciliation? Okay, so people often ask me this question. Okay, it's really not for me to say at a certain level what's appropriate, because I'm a beneficiary of this. It's not really my place to sort of speak for people whose historical trajectories were affected by this, but I do think it's important, as a person who's read a lot and thought about this, to throw out a few ideas for people to think about. Okay, the word reparations scares people. Okay, the knee-jerk reaction to reparations is almost always sort of that you're just looking for a check to be cut, and that this is going to cost us money, and this is scary and bad, and who's going to get the money, and what are they going to do with it? And I really want to get away from that. Okay, I really think that talking about reparative gestures really needs to get away from the exclusive focus on the transfer of financial resources from one party to another. That may be an aspect of it, but it's certainly not the primary one, and it's certainly not the one that I would recommend if I were running things. I would recommend starting with. What I would recommend, and when I talk about this, is I ask people, I say, well, do you want to leave Cornell University a better place than you found it? Do you care about the Cornell that future generations will inherit from you? And if you do, your knowledge of Cornell's past in its entirety can and should play a role in building a better institutional future. Knowing historical precedences and how previous generations conducted themselves should provide the opportunity to make better choices moving forward. Okay, you can talk about this as applied history if you want. I hear a lot from alums of our institution. Not all of it's positive. In fact, I get a lot of grumbling, people complaining that this is what I'm talking about, when in fact we should be proud of our institution's history. And what I say in response is there's no question about that. There are certainly aspects of Cornell's history that are truly commendable. But if that perspective enables us to simply shut down and not talk about aspects of the past that aren't particularly pleasant, or to avoid committing to even a process of seeking out truth and reconciliation, then we're really missing out, I think, on an opportunity to do something now that we can be proud of later. Okay, so that's kind of my particular orientation here. I'm not interested in using this information to make people feel guilty. Okay, guilt all too often devolves into a self-centered, non-productive thought pattern. It's more about encouraging people to take responsibility. Okay, to look at this knowledge, to understand the nuts and bolts of the relationship of Indigenous dispossession to our institution. Okay, it's existential and ongoing significance. And to act, okay, to make a critical choice, to act constructively rather than wallow in guilt or try and run away from this. Okay. It's not going away. This is documented fact. This is something that's there. Okay. This is something that I think calls out for some particularly meaningful reparative action. Okay, and if I were to go into specifics, the kinds of things that I've actually talked about this evening and things that I've kind of mentioned in various conversations with folks here at the university, there's a few things that, were they to happen, I would know that the university was actually taking this seriously. Okay, and there's basically three things, three short-term things that I can talk about here. First being transparency about the financial status of the Morrill Act revenues. Okay. We shouldn't have to speculate based on figures that were reported publicly as recently as 2005. I know the account numbers. This should be public information, I believe. Okay. We're not asking for the university to break open its books. This account in 2005 was one of over 7,000 discrete investment accounts that the university managed. Okay, this is a very small piece of the puzzle, current financial puzzle. Our university has a $10 billion endowment, but what we believe to be $4.5 million of unrestricted income is still coming in from these lands to this very day. Okay, and that is not an insignificant amount of money from the standpoint of some potential actions that could be undertaken. The second thing I would recommend, and that I would kind of see as an indication that the university was serious about doing something, would be a revision of our spoken land acknowledgement to acknowledge the ongoing and existential nature of the university's relationship to dispossession. That just is a more accurate rendering of the past. Okay. And the third thing that's a current initiative that's underway, the university, when it sold its lands in Wisconsin, beginning in the late 1880s, began retaining 50% mineral interest on much of the acreage. So there are about 155,000 acres of land in northern Wisconsin that, to this very day, the university holds a 50% severed mineral interest on that acreage. Okay, on one quarter section parcel in Barron County, there is a pipestone quarry that is a sacred site to the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people. The Lakudere community is the nearest community and has people who identify as caretakers of the site. I would like to see the university transfer its severed mineral interest on that particular parcel to that community. That would be a gesture, I think, that would be welcome. It would be significant to that community's ability to access the site for spiritual purposes. And it's something that, is kind of one of the very last material vestiges that we hold on to from the Morrill Act that could, in a sense, be repatriated. It's an object of cultural patrimony for an Indigenous community, and it would be great to see that transfer to that particular community. Okay, final thing and a long-term thing, and this is much more involved and will probably outlive me, but it's going to require a very substantial rethinking of not only Cornell universities, but I think all land-grant universities' sense of mission. One that emphasizes these institutions' obligations to affected Indigenous nations. Okay, this is going to be a very heavy institutional lift. There's no question about that. But land-grant universities pride themselves on increasing access, equity, and workforce readiness, promoting path-breaking scientific research, and bolstering economic and community engagement. And I took that from the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities website. Okay, there are funds that can be repurposed to this objective. $4.5 million a year would be a very significant starting point for some very positive things that would allow us to begin addressing this in an earnest fashion. Okay. It will require a lot of conversation, a lot of creative engagement, a lot of openness on people's part to learning. Okay. This is not something that goes down very easily for many people. Okay. I'm fully aware of that. I'm fully acknowledging that. But there are people at this institution and out in Indian country who can help make this happen. It all starts with a respectful conversation, one that acknowledges our institution's past. It recognizes that past cannot be undone, but that there are things to be gained by bringing the university into productive dialogue with the descendants of people whose lands and resources actually built the place. And in doing so, we just might realize that these folks have knowledge that can contribute to a better understanding of the human condition. So that's my formal talk. I can stop there. Thanks very much to everybody for your attention, and I'm certainly happy to take questions at this point in time from anyone that might have one.
This is Tom Giroux back, and we'll be curating the questions here. And I always say I get to ask my questions first because that's my job here. So how'd the Morrill Act get its name? And I noticed you mentioned there was a building named the Morrill Building. Was that a tribute to the act?
The sponsor of the bill was Senator Justin Morrill from Vermont. Okay, so he was kind of this was not the first time in American history that people had thought of using public lands to fund universities, but he was the first one to get it over the goal line. And it's really important, I think, to understand and appreciate that this happens during the Civil War, when there are no Southern states in Congress. Okay, they're gone. And they had tried this several times during the 1850s, and it had always been the Southern states that had actually, in the Senate, usually shot down the proposal as kind of what they deemed an unconstitutional use of federal resources. And there are some very interesting constitutional arguments, whether one state should be able to extract revenue from another state to build its university. Okay. And I think a lot of people, I don't think anyone anticipated anything on the scale that Cornell did. But I think there were some people who said, well, wait a minute, you're going to have a whole bunch of northeastern states with no public land going out and basically plundering the public land states at that point in time. Okay. So, those states were not in a position in terms of population to kind of fight that off. So once the Southerners were gone, Mr. Morrill was able to ram that one home over the finish line, and it got folded into the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act too. I mean, this was just a giant reorientation by the United States of what the West was going to do for its future. Okay, and in a sense, the Morrill Act is the smallest piece of that puzzle. The Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act involved much more acreage, but for the land-grant universities, it was absolutely critical.
All right. John Grossman, I'm going to ask you to open the chat and kind of look at his question here because it's a little bit involved.
Okay.
But he noted that some of the lands in Kansas were in the area where Wisconsin tribes were removed to. I think he's talking about mainly the Potawatomi. And he wonders what the connection, if there was any connection.
There is not any connection to that at this point in time. The people in Kansas who were directly affected by those were the Osage in Kansas. So they're It was their property. It does become Indian territory later on, but that is a subsequent development. So there isn't really, to my knowledge, a direct relationship between those two things.
Okay, then John Berg writes, to what extent, if any, did Wisconsin Central Land Grant impact the acquisition and sale of Cornell lands in Wisconsin related to the Homestead Act? I think he's talking about the
railroad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the university fought tooth and nail with the railroad all the time. I mean, the university had several lawyers on retainer. They were constantly throughout the 1870s and 1880s kind of fighting anything that would raise taxes on their property. Okay. And they had very good attorneys, very, they paid top dollar and got very strong advocates out there. And they did fight Wisconsin Central quite a bit, because what happened was when the railway went into an area, the value of the property went up and the taxes went up, and the university, as an absentee landholder, got absolutely hammered by the local assessment people, because they saw Cornell as, this out-of-state interest, and they just absolutely hammered. So yeah, there was a lot. And I would really recommend Paul Gates' book for that. What's interesting is Professor Gates was my predecessor here. I never met him, but his book came out in 1943, and his book is excellent on the 1870s. What Professor Gates was most interested in was the period of time where Cornell was actually sort of struggling to kind of hold its speculative investment together. And then, the book really just sort of falls off a cliff after that. And he doesn't really talk much about the period after 1881, when the university is flush with cash. So the book is excellent on the 1870s, and it has a lot of content on the railroad that I think could be directed, this gentleman could be directed to. It's still in print. It's called The Wisconsin Pinelands of Cornell University. So yeah, Professor Gates went at this question about 80 years ago. The kinds of questions he was asking were a little different from my own, but that's not to say that there's not value in that book. There's actually quite a bit of value. My interests are actually in the period after 1881, where the university is making money hand over fist, and what impact that has on Indigenous people. That isn't a question that concerned Professor Gates in 1943.
And John also asked you to elaborate a little on the mineral rights. I think
Yeah,
you answered.
Yeah, I can be fairly specific about that. So I didn't know anything about this, and I was at we did sort of get the sense that the university may have retained mineral rights on some of the sales it made. And I was given access to some records in our real estate office, and I spent fall of basically 2022 going through those. And we've now sort of figured out that the university, to this day, retains a 50% severed mineral interest on 155,340 acres in 12 different northern Wisconsin counties. And those rights are renewed about every 10 years in the state of Wisconsin. It's a very nominal fee. They don't pay very much money. Most of what they have to pay is for the title searches and things like that. But I think they paid ballpark $15,000 in 2019 for the renewal of that 155,000 acre portfolio. And not many people at this institution knew about that. I didn't know about it, but we now have that all kind of figured out and documented, and that'll be represented in the data visualization project that we're wrapping up.
Oh, cool.
You'll be able to see those properties marked by the section, town, and range.
So who owns the other 50%? The current landowner?
Yeah, the current landowner is 50% and the university. So these are on titles, okay? So when people and I saw letters to this effect where people would purchase a property in Wisconsin and notice this kind of rider on it that had Cornell University having a severed mineral interest in the property, and they would write letters to the university and ask, like, you know, will you sell this off? Will you drop this? Like, and the university, to my knowledge, never did. And they've hung on to these for until now, and as we know now that these northern Wisconsin counties are sitting on quite massive deposits of sulfides, gold, silver, copper, etc., that could potentially be worth a fair bit of money one day. Case in point, I gave a talk here, and I mentioned this, and one of my colleagues in science and technology studies raised his hand and he said, well, you just basically read the ingredients list for electric vehicle batteries. So it's possible that, who knows? But the university has held on to this as kind of a legacy investment, if you will, of the Morrill Act.
So Bonnie wants to know, I'm almost afraid to ask this question, how much time have you put into this project?
Well, it's been kind of an interesting situation because this is not my, I mean, my primary field is on 18th century Haudenosaunee or New York State based Iroquois people. But pandemic hit. The project I was working on had archives in Canada that I couldn't get to. So I've been basically working on it since about August of 2020. I'm just about wrapped up. I've got a summer and hopefully not too much more of writing to finish up some chapters and get it off to the publisher. But it's been really life-changing project. Very, very interesting. And you know, it has impacts in the here and now that are different from my other research. So I've enjoyed it a lot, and I've enjoyed talking to people out in Wisconsin and meeting people and you know, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and just learning about this because this did have a tremendous impact on the northern part of the state's future and historical trajectory.
So Paul kind of equates this Ezra's acquisition of script to something I don't know a lot about, but the Russian magnates who got control of the stock issued by the Russian government during the whole process of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't know a lot about that. But
no, I don't either, but it is an interesting analogy because essentially this is an early example. And again, I think Gates had it right when he described Mr. Cornell's activities as one of the largest individual land speculations in American history. Okay. And it gets kind of, you know, he didn't make a dime from this. And I want to be 100% clear that there is no aspersion on Mr. Cornell personally for his own profit taking from this, or he wasn't dipping his hand into it. He managed this entirely scrupulously. It was all done for the benefit of the university. Okay. So those of us who work at the university are the beneficiaries of this. Okay. And that's kind of the realization that some of us have had and sort of thought, well, you know, if that's the case, then we really ought to be thinking a little bit more about where all this came from. Okay. And what was the process by which it happened. I don't think that the dynamics of Indigenous dispossession entered the heads of many of the people involved with this process during the 19th century. I don't think they thought about it at all. And that's precisely the point. Okay. The point is that for so long, this was treated as just a giant grab bag of free stuff. Okay. In fact, it wasn't free. There was a lot of strings attached to it. And there are a lot of impacts on people that we're really only now just beginning to understand. Okay. So that's really, I think, the thing that's important to understand here. It's the use of, you know, a government resource for a public good Okay, land grant universities generally are seen as a public good, but there have been costs associated with that, and we can't just sort of let ourselves focus on the positives without considering some of the impacts that were adverse to other people.
So Patty wonders if you're going to be coming to Wisconsin again.
I am, but probably not this summer. I sort of promised my editor I'd have it cranked out, and as much as I would love to come back, and I will come back, it probably isn't going to be this summer. But if but I will let folks know when the next time I'm coming out. And I did give a talk at the Chippewa Valley Museum in Eau Claire last year, and actually the part of the reason why I did that is that museum had an image in their archives of the university's real estate office in Eau Claire, and that was the only picture that exists, I think, of the university's land agency. It was in a building that has now been torn down, but the sign is clear as day in the picture. So yeah, the university's connections to Eau Claire are pretty prominent. Okay. And I've worked fairly closely. As it turns out, I have not done too much with folks at Flambeau. I would very much like to get some contacts there. I have done a fair bit with folks at Le Coudray, but obviously there's always more to do and to learn and to talk about with people.
Yeah, we certainly could facilitate some of that. We have a
Yeah.
board member who's done work with Lac de Flambeau, and I've worked with all the tribes in my career, but so there's one more thing I wanted to go to here. Oh, Susan mentioned in the Q&A that the connection between the Ojibwa people and the French explorers goes way back, prior to the logging era, but it certainly was also present during the logging era.
Oh yeah, no, that's certainly true. I think what's interesting is that the scale of it increases dramatically at this point. I would argue that there's much more, and it does change those communities in a way that even the intermarriage prior to that, I think, did not. I think it takes the indigenous communities, how to phrase this, it orients many of the children of those unions to settler society in ways that was not the case prior to that point in time. That's kind of how I would say it. And that's also partly a function of the boarding schools, the missionaries, et cetera, et cetera.
The
But
assimilation.
Yeah, so before, that period of time, the children were not as assimilated into non-native culture as they were afterwards. So I think that's the shift. That's a good point to clarify.
Yeah, you could almost argue that the French were assimilated into the Ojibwa culture more.
Certainly early on they were.
Yeah,
certainly early on they were. Yeah, definitely.
Donald, am I missing anything?
You have gotten all the questions, and so I think we're good there. There are a couple compliments besides the questions that came through, and I would just echo those. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, it's a lot of fun, and I learn something every time, and people are welcome to email me. I'll put my email in the chat here if people want to ask further questions, or if they have information, as I was talking about earlier in the conversation with Tom and Donald. One thing that I am interested in learning more about is sort of the post 20th century environmental impacts of logging, both on and off reservations in Wisconsin, and that would be something that if anyone had leads on that or information, I'd be more than happy to hear about. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention, and I enjoyed this a lot.
And for people who are listening or watching this presentation as a recording, that email address is wp35@cornell.edu. That way you can reach out directly to Jon. Thank
Yeah.
you very much, Jon. Again, it was great.
Oh, thank you.
Tom and I are taking the next 2 months off. So our next webinar presentation will be in August. And Dr. Katie Weichelt will be talking about paper mills on the Wisconsin River. I don't have the exact title and description yet, but within the week that'll be up on our website. So you can go there and pre-register for that then. Okay. Thanks much, everyone. Have a great night.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.